Welcome to the second appointment of the Participate in Europe series. Today we are exploring the European institutions, and we are together with Professor Blokker that will talk about them together. So, when one says Europe, often one means the European Union or the EU member state. But what is exactly the European Union?
Well, apart from a geographical space, the European continent, the European Union is a long-standing integration project, which in much more simple terms means that countries decided to collaborate, to team up, to work together, because they realized that singular countries, sovereign states, couldn't do things all by themselves. So they started out with 6 countries, but by now we are with 27 states. And originally it was an economic project. So the coal and steel community, as it was called in the early 1950s, was the first way of collaborating economically. But there was much more to it. Of course, a very urgent issue at the time that has in a certain way re-emerged was that the core objective of collaboration was to avoid war. And so there's a very interesting principle in a way behind the European collaboration project. You could call it douce commerce, or in English, sweet commerce, which basically says if you trade between each other, you're much less likely to go to war with each other. So in a way, economic integration as a kind of civilizing process. And of course you can make it much more tangible if you think about today. Let's say you're a young person in the European Union and think about you're looking for a job. You might look for a job in a city, in Florence or in Amsterdam, or in maybe you're born in Riga. But you might also think a little bit broader. Look for a job in your region, maybe in your country, or indeed maybe in the European space. And so the labor market has become also, to a large extent, European. But again, if you think about collaborating states, it's also clear that you need some rules. You need to observe some rules together. You need probably to develop more rules over time, because you might start collaborating in different areas. And you need somebody that steps in when a dispute, which will inevitably happen, will help you solve the dispute. And so that's where the institutions come from. Originally already in the 1950s, an institutional triad, as they call it, so 3 institutions. They're still with us. They changed a lot over time, but they help us to maintain the rules, to make sure that when disputes arise, that we overcome them. So ultimately it's about working together.
That is amazing if you think about it. Of course, the European integration project has changed a lot since then, and is not anymore about merely coal and steel. So what do these European institutions do nowadays?
Well, that's a good question, but it's also a tough one, I have to say. So let's look a little bit at the institutions that are there, and that have been there for a while, as I said. So there's the European Parliament. It discusses laws and policies. It's a very important institution because it represents the European citizens. It has become much stronger over time. Then we have the European Commission, which is a kind of government, but it's also, let's call it a kind of public administration. It actually creates most of the policies, it initiates the policies, and one of them is very familiar to us. That's the mobility program, the Erasmus Plus program, which is just one of the very many policies that comes from the Commission, but it is also implemented by some of its main entities. They call that DGs. Then there's the Court of Justice of the European Union. And we said before, well, disputes, conflicts arise, and they do. And they have been arising many times in the history of European integration. The European Court of Justice is one of the main arbiters there. And it was, of course, also very important in terms of helping to understand what EU law says, what the common rules are about, how we should interpret them. And then finally, there's a in a way, a peculiar institution called the Council, where the European member states actually have their say where they work together. And so part of the Council is heads of state, prime ministers.
But as we said before, the institutions have radically changed throughout the years. Isn't it right?
Well, that's certainly true. I mean, as we said in the 1950s, the nucleus of the European Union and its institutions was already there, but those institutions have changed dramatically, as the European Union at large, by the way. And so if you think of the Parliament, when it started out, it was a part-time parliament. National parliamentarians were sent by their governments, and they were basically part-time. That's completely different nowadays. You have a full-blown parliament. It's directly elected by us, by the European citizens since 1979, and it has dramatically expanded its powers. So much so that it's now also of interest to, let's say, the more dark forces in terms of lobbyists that try to steer policies into a certain direction, also using bribes. And we had a couple of scandals recently. Qatargate is one of them, and a more recent one is Russiagate. So that's for the Parliament. The Commission equally started out as a much more small institution. By now it's a full-blown European bureaucracy, and it plays a major role in promoting policies. For instance, it has been behind forming a European single market, which is not only coal and steel anymore, but much more. It has been behind the single currency, the euro, that we all use. It is behind recent policies that try to revive the European economy with, for instance, next generation EU funding. Then there's the court. The court was also much more modest in the early days, but by now it's a full-blown international court which plays a major role in conflict resolution, interpretation of law, but also in a way it makes law up to a certain extent. And so it has turned European Union law into something that is prior to national law. They call it primacy, and it has a direct effect in actual national member states. And to make it more tangible, the Court of Justice has been core in pushing market integration, and one of its main rulings in the 1990s was the so-called Bosman ruling, which actually liberated the football market. So that's why we have now an almost fully operative football market in Europe, where football players can be very easily transferred from one national club to another and to other clubs in other countries. Then we have indeed the Council, and also the Council has changed dramatically. Part of the Council was only a kind of spontaneously organized club, spontaneously organized by the member states in the 70s, but then it has turned into a full-blown European institution, so much so that you could say it's probably the one we hear most about. It's the most media savvy because it has these big summits every year.
One European party, a transnational party led by young people, Volt, has proposed in its campaign for the European elections to turn the Council into the European Senate. Is this an interesting idea, right?
I think it's a really interesting idea. It's also a way of sort of innovating European democracy. There are actually even more radical, audacious proposals out there. Some people saying, well, maybe we should turn the Council into a European citizens or people's assembly. The only thing is that I'm afraid that both ideas will not fly very soon because there's no consensus on changing the institutions in this manner.
Thanks for tuning into the Participating Europe series. Until next time, and remember, the EU is not only a faraway institution, it's all of us, everyday people, that make the EU happen.